Hello, everyone. This is going to be 1.4 Spain and France in the Americas. So, our primary source is from Francisco Vasquez de Coronado, one of the many Spanish conquistadors traveling throughout America, both central and north, during this time. And he says, "What I am sure of is that there is not any gold nor any other metal in all that country, and the other things of which they had told me are nothing but little villages, and in many of these they do not plant anything and do not have any houses except of skins and sticks, and they wander around with the cows," basically saying that he has not found anything when looking for gold. So, our objectives: we are going to explain the religious rivalry among European nations during this time, describe Spanish society in both New Spain and Peru. We're going to evaluate the causes and effects of the Spanish imperial policies of the American Southwest, explain how the fur trade affected the French and the Indians in North America, and we are going to describe the French expansion into Louisiana as well. So let's look at how the troubles in Europe eventually led to America as well. So Spain had been the first European country to reach America, at least in recent times. The Scandinavians got there way back in the day, but the Spanish got there first, and it also made them very wealthy. They were able to get a lot of gold and silver and other supplies and resources out of their Spanish colonies in the New World. And they used their money to explore further and also to go to war with some of their other neighbors. This led to other countries in Europe, like England and France and the Netherlands, wanting to get into the American territory game as well. And this fight between these countries really only got worse due to the fact that religion got involved. We see a separation thanks to Martin Luther. Martin Luther was a German priest who left the Catholic Church over disagreements of both theology and practice, and he broke from the Catholic Church in 1517. So here's Martin Luther, 1483 to 1546. He was a theologian, professor, and priest who was kicked out of the Catholic Church for his disagreements, including he didn't like what they were doing with what are called indulgences. He thought they were corrupt. He also disagreed on questions of faith. And so this started the Protestant religions. He was a critical figure of the Protestant Reformation movement. And so he is an important figure for many reasons, most of all, but for that. So, what is the difference between Catholicism and Protestantism? Well, Protestants do not believe that priests and ministers are necessary for salvation. Salvation comes through faith, and that is it. They also didn't believe that the Pope had any real power. In fact, they said there should be no Pope. They did not like the Pope, and they didn't like the fact that the Catholic Church, they felt, was corrupt. They were basically, the Catholic Church was collecting money by saying, if you give us money, we'll make sure that you get out of purgatory quicker after you die, and you can go sooner up to heaven. After Martin Luther left the Catholic Church, Protestantism actually divided into several other denominations. Factions, the wrong word. Denominations, a better word. So think of Lutherans, Presbyterians, Baptists, so on and so forth these days. And the rulers of the Netherlands and England later became Protestant. And so we see this is not just a war for land and between these European kingdoms because they wanted to colonize, but also because they had differences of religion, and religion back then was a hugely important and divisive issue. So let's look at how Spain governed governed the American Empire. So we looked at Cortez and the conquistadors. After that, the Spanish wanted to actually settle the Americas, not just conquer them and take their stuff. Eventually the Spanish started to, create towns. And they thought that the American colonies would be a good way to get more taxes. So, Spanish Catholic monks and friars and priests acted as missionaries, people out to convert, and they were working to convert Native Americans to Christianity and to make them more like European Spaniards as well. Now, the friars were not necessarily as brutal as the conquistadors were, but they often did force the natives to give up their traditions and their religion, and they were often required to work for the Spanish in order to pay for their conversion, what is known as encomienda. Spanish soldiers also kept forts with soldiers in it so that they could protect the priests and the Spanish in the area. These are known as presidios, forts. They made sure that, first of all, the Spanish were well protected, and that second of all, other countries like France didn't come in and take over. So this is the remains of a presidio in Texas. Now, in the 30s and 40s, Spain controlled almost all of the Americas and split them into two regions, what are known as viceroyalties, territories. Each one of them is ruled over by a local colonial governor known as a viceroy, and the viceroy is appointed by the king. So we have New Spain, and we have the viceroyalty of Peru beneath it, which is basically all of South America. Now, viceroys had a lot of power in the New World. However, they had to share power with representatives of the church and with important Spaniards who also had a measure of power, and they reported directly to the king. There was no democracy here. This was not an elected representation. So here are the two, or here is New Spain, right here. New Spain is Central America mostly. And here's the Viceroyalty of Peru in South America. That little bit of gray on the right-hand side is owned by Portugal. Now, most of the Spanish people in America, about 250,000 of them, were actually male. Now, this meant that many of them either took Native American wives or sometimes didn't take Native American wives, but still had children with these women. And Spanish nobles in the America decided that they were going to set up what are called castas, this idea of levels of social structure and hierarchy to make sure that those with more pure blood Spanish blood had the most power, and those of mixed blood or no Spanish blood were down at the bottom. So here are the four general sections of the castas. Now, this gets way more complicated if you're looking at it closely, if you're looking at who has children with whom. But in general, the peninsulares are up at the top. They are the Spanish, born at the top of the born in Spain. So you might want to know this. This is going to be important for the test. So peninsulares are Spanish people who are actually from mainland Spain. Beneath them are people of full Spanish blood, but who were born in the Americas, criollos, sometimes known as Creoles. Then we have a group known as mestizos. They are a mixed blood group. They are born in America to Spanish and native parents. We're going to take a look at these guys in class because the mestizo culture has a lot of importance to Spanish and Mexican and American history. Lastly, we have the Indios, Native Americans. Many of this group died due to disease, but they are also down at the bottom. Along with them, down at the bottom of the social group, are enslaved Africans when the African slave trade kicks into gear. So here is a triangle, a pyramid of the social structure of New Spain. This might be a good thing to learn. You don't have to learn the Spanish, but it would be good to know who's on top and who's on the bottom and why, according to the beliefs of Spain's social structure. Now, Spain also created many large cities during this time, which were the center of Spanish culture. So over here we can see Santo Domingo on the island of Hispaniola. This is nowadays inside the Dominican Republic. Now, the further away from the city you lived, the less power you had. So again, there's sort of a city-based social structure as well. Now, let's look at Spanish explorers who went up north into what is today America, the United States. Cortez did very well for himself, and this inspired other conquistadors to travel throughout the Americas looking for gold, looking for good supplies, and looking for things that they could trade. Two of the biggest explorers were Vasquez de Coronado and Hernando de Soto. They both went primarily north of Mexico into what is today the United States. So Hernando de Soto went into Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas. He was looking for gold, and he also tended to massacre Native American villages if he found them. After De Soto died, his men returned to Mexico pretty much empty-handed. So here is De Soto's route from Cuba up into the American Southeast. There's also Coronado, Francisco de Coronado. He went north from Mexico into the Great Plains looking for gold. The Pueblo kept saying, hey, the gold's really far away from us, so maybe don't ever come back. Just keep going that way. Eventually you'll find gold. Coronado fell for this, and he started looking for this great city of gold called Cibola. When he couldn't find it, he became very upset and angry and came back and slaughtered many of the Pueblo on his way back to Mexico. However, he made it all the way up into Kansas. So Coronado made it very far into even the American Midwest. Now, after De Soto and Coronado, the Spanish focused more on South America and the American Southwest. However, this does mean that the French saw an opening. French Protestants, known as Huguenots, landed in North America. They built a fort in Florida, and Spain said, hey, you're not allowed to do that. This is our territory. And so we see that it's a combination of, Spain and France are generally not hugely big fans of each other, but also, in this case, it's a religious question. After the Spanish defeated the French, they founded the city of St. Augustine in that place. However, it's still very difficult to attract people to the middle of a wilderness. And so mainly the people who are there are friars and protection. However, over time, they started to build more and more missions throughout Florida, including this one, Mission Nombre de Dios, in St. Augustine, was founded in 1565 and is still built and up and around today. Now let's look at conflict they had with Native Americans in New Mexico. So the Spanish established a new colony called New Mexico with Santa Fe as the capital. However, it was not as wealthy, not as powerful, and it was kind of far away too. And a lot like Florida, the Spanish had trouble attracting people to the middle of a barren wilderness. The only people were really monks and soldiers, and they were also vastly outnumbered by the local Pueblo tribe. Now, the friars also required that the Pueblos give up their native language and speak Spanish, dress like Spanish people, practice Christianity, in fact, practice Roman Catholicism. They also got rid of the Pueblo kivas, which are their worship sites, their small temples. So this is a kiva these days with the roof removed. Now, for a few generations, the Pueblo did try to adapt or at least survive, partially because they were afraid of Spanish soldiers, and partially because they wanted what the Spanish had. However, they didn't want to give up their religion, and they saw Christianity as sort of another option or a thing that they could blend with their older beliefs, not a replacement. And so in the late 1600s, their population began to decline due to disease and drought, and this meant that the Pueblo could no longer meet the work conditions and the crops the Spanish required. So what happened was they revolted. In 1680, they rose up against the Spanish, led by a man named Pope. Pope was a religious and political leader of the Pueblo people, and the Apache actually joined with the Pueblo, and together they actually defeated the Spanish for a few years. They actually kicked the Spanish out of New Mexico. Unfortunately for the Pueblo, this did not bring them peace, and eventually after Pope died, the Spanish reconquered this area. And this time, they were actually willing to allow more freedoms to the Pueblo Indians as a way to make sure that they wouldn't go out and start another uprising. So they were willing to allow them to keep their religious beliefs, for instance, and they were working to protect them against larger tribes. So here is a statue of Pope. Pope was around from 1630 to about 1688. born in what is now New Mexico. He was the leader of the Pueblo Revolt. But interestingly, New Mexico thinks very highly of Popé these days, to the point where every state gets to send two statues to Capitol Hill, and New Mexico chose one of theirs to be Popé. So this is actually a statue of Popé at the U.S. Capitol building. Now, that is the Spanish. Let's look at the French. The French started to explore the Americas in the 1500s. We saw them already. They bumped into the Spanish in Florida, and the Spanish, fought them out. They mainly stayed up north, though, around the St. Lawrence River in modern-day Canada. They were trading mainly furs with the native Canadians, with the Native Americans. They were not interested in creating large-scale colonies like the Spanish did. They were mainly focused on trade and trying to find a passage to Asia, what they called the Northwest Passage, which it is important to realize did not exist at that time. So, here's the St. Lawrence River. This is where mainly the French colonies were, including the main colony of Quebec that we're going to see. And this is the Northwest Passage. It did not exist at the time. Like I said, you could not get through there. The ice was too thick. And so they kept trying over and over again, but they could not get through the Northwest Passage. Neither could the English. Now, eventually the French claimed the area around St. Lawrence as theirs. They claimed it for fish hunting and for trading of furs, especially the beavers. Beaver fur was very highly sought because they were nearly extinct in Europe, and beaver hats and beaver furs they were waterproof since beaver fur repels water. And so the natives traded beaver fur for metal tools and weapons, and they did a lot of trading. So very quickly, Native Americans stopped their old way of life and became mainly focused on trade with the Europeans, to the point where beavers were nearly hunted to extinction in America as well. And here is the North American beaver, who is partially responsible for the French colonization of the Americas. And I don't know, I just don't trust this guy. I think it's the hands. He looks as if he's plotting something. He looks kind of devious. Anyway, so native groups started looking for more and more beaver fur. So natives actually started fighting other tribes for the right to beaver hunting land. This basically started tribal warfare, and whichever tribe had more guns usually won. And this led to many wars between tribes trying to sort of be the ones that the French traded with. Eventually, to stop this fighting between French fur traders, there was a fur trading company established in a city known as Quebec along the St. Lawrence River. This guy is happy that they're fighting for his fur. I think I'll call him Evil Beaver. Yeah, still don't trust him. So this is New France in blue up there. You might notice also it's a really big amount of land, really big amount of territory, but not a lot of people live there. So, like I said, unlike the Spanish, the French were not interested in subjugating or overthrowing the Native Americans. They wanted to deal with them and trade with them. They also didn't take as much land. They owned everything in that blue area, but they didn't have a lot of big cities, which meant that they got along better generally because they weren't taking over native land. So we see that Samuel de Champlain, the founder of Quebec, sided actually with the Huron tribe and actually helped them defeat the Iroquois tribe during this time. So like I said, there was a lot of intertribal warfare. So here's Samuel de Champlain, born in France in 1567, died in 1635. He explored a lot of the American Northeast, including Lake Champlain in the American Northeast, which is named after him. He is known today as the father of New France, and we don't have any portraits of him, just like Columbus. We believe that this is a self-portrait that Champlain drew in his diary. Now, using guns against the Iroquois ended up being bad for Champlain and the French in the long run because the Iroquois began hit-and-run tactics, what we call guerrilla warfare, guerrilla tactics. And they also, the Iroquois sided with the Dutch. and so they went up against the French and their allies, their Native American allies. So this guy is happy to see everything just fall to ruin, I guess. Anyway, so the French sent missionaries into this area as well. So we do see that even though the French were much more live and let live with the Native Americans, they were also sending missionaries into New France. We had Jesuit priests like Père Marquette who traveled down the Mississippi River. They worked to convert the Huron, but eventually the Huron were defeated by the Iroquois. And we do see that Jesuits were mainly successful near the biggest towns like Quebec and Montreal. So, what was life like in New France? The French and Spanish colonies were both controlled by the royals. This is how they're similar. And like Spain, French leaders were appointed, they were not elected. This is, again, not a democracy. However, by 1750, New France only had about 15,000 people, partially because of the lack of bigger cities, but also because it was cold in Canada, which I know will come as a shock to many of you, but it's cold up in Canada. Most of the French arrivals were actually farmers, and they were, again, mainly men. They're not traveling as families, they're traveling as one person, and they're usually around the few big French settlements. Now, the French settlers actually borrowed some of the ways of native life in order to survive. They looked at how the Native Americans were living in this area, and they sort of copied them. Some took it a step further and actually married into Native American tribes. A lot of these French fur traders, sometimes known as coureurs de bois or runners of the forest, took on Native American wives and had mixed-race children known as the Métis. The Métis, however, were seen as, they were treated much better than the Mestizo were. Oftentimes the Mestizo were not very well thought of. The Métis were seen as, they had the benefits of both their French ancestry and their Native American ancestry. The French made several alliances with these tribes in order to defeat their Native American enemies. And French explorers continued to look for routes around America so they could get to Asia, the Northwest Passage. When that didn't work, they headed south instead. They floated down the Mississippi River, hoping that eventually the Mississippi would lead to the Pacific Ocean. It did not. It emptied into the Gulf of Mexico. And so instead, Robert de La Salle, who was the man floating down the Mississippi, eventually claimed all of that land for France as well. He named it Louisiana after King Louis. The main city of this is New Orleans, which is a very prosperous seaport for the French in Louisiana. So here's Robert de La Salle. Now, Louisiana was also hot, muggy, and full of bugs that gave you malaria, so it did not attract a whole lot of settlers at first yet either. And by 1731, the white settlers, only about 2,000 of them, were actually well outnumbered by African enslaved people. Mainly, the French were interested in keeping Louisiana as a way to stop the English and the Spanish from taking over. As we're going to see in our next chapter, the English are coming in very soon, and we will get to that in the next chapter.